It's going to have a huge impact in terms of the UK PLC. I think we know that for sure. And there is a concern that we are at a point of cliff edge, and we're going to see over the next few months, we're going to add to the 23,000 venues that have closed over the last 5 years.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Michael Kill on the crisis facing nighttime industries.
Well, the worry that we have is job losses. 2.11 million people employed in the nighttime economy. It's a major employer of 18 to 30-year-olds.
Michael says the closure of our nightlife is bad news for Britain's finances.
It's a huge contributor to the UK economy, £153 billion worth of turnover, and although GVA is stagnated, there is still a huge amount of money that they put through the UK PLC, bigger than automotive, bigger than beauty, and bigger than fashion. So it deserves a seat at the table, and it deserves a stronger consideration.
He says despite dwindling numbers, people still want to go out and enjoy themselves.
You know, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there at the moment that suggests that people don't want to go out. And the reality is they do, without a doubt, but they just haven't got that money in their pocket to go out, or otherwise they would.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Michael Kill, CEO of the Nighttime Industries Association. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me on.
I think everyone feels there's something not quite right with Britain's nightlife. We're seeing pubs closing, nightclubs, music venues. Could you flesh that out for us and help us understand how serious the situation is?
Well, I think it starts really with the pandemic. We were first to close in terms of the sector as a whole and last to open when you look at the later night economy. And what we've seen is that double hit. So we've gone from a pandemic position to the cost of operating crisis. And what we're seeing is many of these businesses facing a 30 to 40% more expensive sort of bill to operate these businesses. And now what we're seeing is with the April cliff edge, which we're already in, is seeing each of those businesses, predominantly small, medium enterprise businesses, extend that challenge by about £30,000 to £80,000 per business. So as you can appreciate, there are many industries out there that wouldn't be able to survive that, but we seem to have weathered it to a point. But the challenge that we have at the moment is many of the businesses out there are just seeing a very bleak future.
Before we go into those driving factors behind it, why is this important? Why is our nighttime industries important to British culture?
Well, I think for many reasons. I mean, it's really important for communities in terms of shaping communities, for one. The mental health or well-being, the physical, social and mental well-being element is really important. But what we also forget is when people choose a university, they choose a course and then they look at nightlife. They look at that balance, the same way that some of the fintech companies will choose a place to set up their head office like Google, but with the mindset that there is a younger workforce, so they will consider nightlife as a really important position to undertake. So I think it has lots of really important pieces that add to community. But the other thing we've got to remember is it's a huge contributor to the UK economy, £153 billion worth of turnover. And although GVA is stagnated, there is still a huge amount of money that they put through the UK PLC, bigger than automotive, bigger than beauty, and bigger than fashion. So it deserves a seat at the table and it deserves a stronger consideration.
We just go into a bit more what the financial consequences would be if we lose our nighttime industries.
Well, the worry that we have is job losses. 2.11 million people employed in the nighttime economy. It's a major employer of 18 to 30-year-olds. It's a stepping stone. It's a character builder for many of these people moving into other jobs, etc. The local community, the local economy is impacted because it supports so many businesses. I think we did some work before on things like casinos and large venues. It contributes some £2.4 million to businesses in the local economy within a 25-mile radius. So if you can imagine taking some of those businesses away, the impact it would have on the local economy, as well as the community as a whole and the job sort of market as a situation, particularly for some of those younger audiences.
You already mentioned taxes. I think it's one of everyone's favourite or not favourite subjects at the moment. What impact are taxes having on the industry?
Well, I mean, we always talk about being overtaxed and over-regulated, without a doubt. I mean, when you look at getting a beer up on the bar, we're taxed 3 times. You know, when you look at things like late night levies, having to actually pay for policing and maintenance after midnight because you trade past midnight. We also don't see the support in terms of things like transport infrastructure, policing after midnight as well, which presents challenges and also is a deterrent of people coming out later. A recent survey that we've put together of over 2,000 18 to 30-year-olds suggests that economics is a primary reason why people don't come out, but two others are the fact that they don't feel safe and there's no guarantee of getting home because they've lost confidence in the transport infrastructure. So I think for us, we're paying a lot of money and not getting a lot of support, given the fact that we have a huge economic input into UK PLC, both on a local and a national base.
I think some of these issues are not kind of so familiar to our viewers, but so venues have to pay towards the policing of the venue, do they?
Yeah, so the late night levy is something that was brought together some time ago, and what it means in certain areas across the country, there will be a contribution for operating past midnight towards policing and towards maintenance in terms of cleaning the streets. So as you can appreciate, on top of your business rates and top of your business improvement district contribution, you would also then have to input into a late night levy, which is an additional taxation.
Right. And also the transport thing as well. I mean, it's interesting to think about. If the transport links aren't there, people are just stuck when they come out of late night venues.
Well, it's a huge challenge. We've seen the market impacted by it heavily, particularly in places like London and Manchester. I mean, London's very lucky because it's got a strong infrastructure. The challenge that we have is it's now starting to impact the market. So when you look at midweek in London as an example, what we are seeing is people going home early because they've got no confidence in that late night transport infrastructure. A really simple example is my son's 26. He goes out for a club night on the weekend, but because the transport infrastructure is so poor, past 3, 4 in the morning, he then has to wait in a train station until the early morning train so that he can get home. If you can imagine that, if that was a daughter or a member of family, safety is a real concern. So I think we have the opportunity to make a difference, and we're working with the Department of Transport to try and look at those opportunities, but it's not happening quick enough. And with the economics, safety and transport being those primary issues, we need to deal with them as quickly as possible so we can move forward. But we need the appetite to deal with them on a local and a national scale.
You mentioned over-regulation. Can you give us some examples to how the industry is over-regulated?
Well, we have a very onerous sort of licensing regime at the moment, which is managed by local authorities, and policing being an important authority within that. What we've seen off the back of things like the pandemic is a focus on things like noise. So as you can appreciate, while the businesses were closed, it was very quiet for residents. And now we've reopened some years back, there have been a huge amount of challenges around noise reports. But as you can understand, there was no consideration around the fact that we had almost 2 years of closure where nighttime economy wasn't operating. And now we've sort of bounced back, and there is no recognition or understanding that there will be a settling period. There's a lot of work that's being done in terms of ensuring things are soundproofed. But I think the failures really start at the sort of national planning framework and actually legislation around something called agent of change, which protects both businesses and residents by creating strong mitigations around noise leakage, which supports both sides of the fence. And at the moment, that's not being dealt with in terms of moving towards a primary legislation like the Scottish government has done. So that's something that we're working hard to put in place. And what that really means is, if I've got a venue or a nightclub that's in situ and someone builds some flats opposite, then it's on the planner or the developer to mitigate the exposure to the noise from one side within that sort of residence, either with double glazing or soundproofing or thickness of walls and entrance and exit points, etc., to make a difference. And the same way the other way around. If we're going to build a venue, we need to make sure that the noise mitigation is strong if there is an in-situ block of flats or housing near to that space. So I think it's a really important piece of legislation that needs to be considered more broadly, because at the moment we're losing venues and businesses because of it.
I had a planner on before who was talking about NIMBYism and how it affects what he was doing. So the same for the nighttime industry?
Without a doubt. I mean, there are vexatious reports and, resident groups that, some that do have genuine challenges, but we also have some, similar to the environments and conversations we have around Soho, which is around trying to sanitize the area. And, we just have to recognize that when you're in an inner city, you have to understand you're moving into a space there is going to be a level of noise. And if you move into the middle of Soho or Westminster or anywhere like that, you have to recognize that it's a vibrant area, at all times in the evening. The mitigations need to be in place, but this has been a failure of planning more than anything else. And also the relationship between licensing and planning is not very strong. So what we're seeing is planning move forward with building residential accommodation, licensing being unaware of it, and those conversations would help mitigate any issues long term. But at the moment we're dealing with a legacy of noise complaints over a lack of mitigation for noise within areas right the way across the country, not just London.
We've talked quite a bit about the industry, but what about from the other side? How can we reinvigorate the want for people to go and enjoy nightlife?
Well, I think the really important thing is there is still a huge desire to go out. The fact that people can't afford it is a challenge, which impacts on frequency, dwell time, the time they spend in the spaces and spend. But we're, something to draw back on as well. We're such an important part for the creative economy. New DJs, artists, we're a platform for performance, somewhere that they can refine their craft. So a lot of people get into our industry, whether it be work or performance, to actually get a platform for audiences and fan base. And there's a huge amount of support for it. I mean, whether you talk about electronic music, live music, there's a huge amount of work that goes into the backdrop of actually presenting new products, new output, immersive experiences, whether you talk about drum sheds or Sub Club in Glasgow. There are some amazing experiences out there and developing off the back of what the market wants. But I think that the important thing, and I think there's a lot of misinformation out there at the moment that suggests that people don't want to go out. And the reality is they do, without a doubt, but they just haven't got that money in their pocket to go out, or otherwise they would.
I know you travel quite a bit internationally. Is this a British thing that we're seeing, the downturn in nightlife, or is it an international thing?
Very much international. I think everyone's suffering. I was on a call this morning with Belgium talking about their challenges, and they are very, very similar. Whether you talk about New South Wales, Tokyo, or you talk about Berlin, they all have the same challenges. Clubs are extremely challenged at the moment. Bars are starting to make a resurgence. Competitive socialising, which is things like ping pong and darts and pool and karaoke, is starting to sort of regenerate some of nighttime economy. But what we are always seeing is that potential for earlier nights because of the challenges around transport and safety, which I think is prevalent right the way across the world at the moment.
I know you mentioned it, but could you talk just a little about the lockdowns and what impact they had on our nighttime industries?
I think the biggest thing to sort of highlight here is the uncertainty. People didn't know what the future looked like, so the lockdowns were going from sort of one phase to another. The communication was very poor up until very late in the sort of pandemic period, but I think what we've got to recognise is also the disproportionate support for some of those business categories. Pubs, etc., which have got a smaller sort of operating cost base, were able to survive, but they got a coordinated and proportionate support, whereas nightclubs and bigger venues got the same amount of support as those pubs. And as you can appreciate, what would last a pub a couple of weeks lasted a couple of nights in terms of the clubs. So what we have seen is the bigger businesses actually having to take on more debt. So that's why clubs are really sort of desperately challenged at the moment. To give you a really simple example, when you looked at the biggest nightclub operator, which had about 56 nightclubs at the time, were burning cash at about £1.6 million per month. £1 million in rent, 600 grand in operating costs and people, and it was getting £156,000 in support. So proportionately, that was a very short-lived mechanism before they went under. And scalably, that's what we saw across the board for some of those sort of key categories. So hence the reason why we've lost about a third of nightclubs. Pubs and bars were able to sort of mothball in some cases, but retain a position of certain level of business. But all of them suffered heavily and had to take on debt. But proportionately, there was a much higher debt ratio when you look at late night economy compared to evening and night time.
I think in my village there were probably 9 pubs and now there are 3. There is a sense that a lot of people, they don't really know what to do anymore. It's like they were such a cultural thing. Everyone would go there and then they just kind of vanished. I mean, what can kind of smaller kind of villages and places like that do?
I think the key thing is go out and support them. Recognise how important they are in terms of things like loneliness for elderly, going out and people watching, compared to celebrations, going out for a family meal, or just going down to the local to have a cup of coffee or a beer. You know, I think the thing is we've kind of lost that identity of them, which we need to rejuvenate. So I think local communities need to really work hard to try and sustain those important sort of British institutions, whether you're a pub or a nightclub. We know we've seen lots of nightclubs disappear from those sort of outer towns and smaller cities, but pubs are a really important sort of mainstay. So I think the key to it is, we say eat out to help out. I think go out to help out should be the next regime that we should push. And it's just a matter of going out. Have your business meeting in the pub. Go and have a bit of lunch with a friend. Meet, celebrate, be part of that really important sort of community role. Because I think we've tend to have lost a little bit of community from that sort of insular period of closure, which has made people somewhat socially anxious in some respects.
What are if we can't turn this ship around, what will the consequences be?
Well, it's going to have a huge impact in terms of the UK PLC. I think we know that for sure. And there is a concern that we are at a point of cliff edge, and we're going to see over the next few months, we're going to add to the 23,000 venues that have closed over the last 5 years. So I think we're going to lose some of that shape. We're worried that the high street is going to change. We're also worried that some of the corporates will buy into some of the independents, and that gentrification will be part of an internal sort of shift. And I think it's important we try and keep some of that independent business ownership, but purely for the fact that they are the entrepreneurs, the drivers of creativity in the high street. So I think for us, the worst case scenario is we lose those businesses. People don't have the opportunity to go and work and try and shape their character in their sort of youth as they move forward. We lose the creative spaces for people to perform, but we also lose that community base that's really important to encourage investment and growth, but also be that hub where people interact and network and do business and etc. So if you think just on those bases alone, that's a huge loss to local community as well as the national creative and social landscape.
Well, what can we do to make things better? I mean, what were the 3 key changes that you'd like to see be?
I think the primary concern is the economics. We've got to really get to the government and let them understand that they can't turn their back on the industry that have been part of the rejuvenation from the 2007 financial crash. We've got to start working in terms of safety late night, in terms of CCTV, lighting and policing on the street, which I think we've failed on so far and need to work towards. And then I think the important thing is getting that transport infrastructure in place. Those failings are the key things where young people have said that they would go out later if they had those assurances. They had more money in their pocket. They felt safer now, particularly women and girls, and something that's a focus at the moment. But also that guarantee that they can get home. You know, people don't want to be stranded. They don't want to be het up with huge bills from taxis just so that they can get out to the suburbs. So I think that's a generalisation of some of the challenges that we have. We also need to look at the regulation side. We need to look at some deregulated position on it. We need to look at licensing and planning easements. We need to look at pro-growth, pro-investment proposition in terms of local and national environments. And I think we also need to start cherishing and celebrating the culture, particularly counterculture, electronic music, grassroots movements, etc., that are really, really important to local communities, and that stepping stone up to the bigger opportunities. And outside of that, I think the one thing that the government needs to start doing is making policy on data. Substantiate what you're doing with pure data, not a thought or a feeling or a consideration, on data that backs up the evidence to move forward and generate a positive growth, positive investment position, pro-community and pro-nighttime economy for us.
Michael Kill, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.